I'd like to call this work session to order. This work session deals with liquor license renewal. Let's go around the table and identify ourselves for the record. Pete, we'll start with you.
Pete Peterson, Assembly.
Forrest Bucklar.
Eric Croft.
Suzanne.
Big training.
Sarah Oates, Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office.
Jane Sawyer, Alcohol and Marijuana Control Office.
Andy Honest, Clerk's Office.
Okay. And we've got Dean Gates coming in the translator's chair. So, Mandy, we'll turn the time over to you.
I'm sorry?
We'll turn the time over to you.
Okay. So this is going to kind of be similar to the work session we did last year on the liquor license renewal process. Since we're coming to the close of the renewal period, we decided now is a good time to delve into the rest of the application types that you guys see throughout the year, because those are going to be what you're dealing with for the rest of this period. And that's typically going to be new licenses, transfer licenses. The clerk's office receives a lot of inquiries from proposed licensees asking what they need to do, especially the new ones, if they've never been in the industry before. So we like to direct them to the planning department so that they can get their special land use permit application started, or find out if they already have one that is applied to that premises. And then they also go to AMCO to file their actual application for the license. Most people know about AMCO. They don't know about the planning department necessarily, so we try and make sure that we get them right off the bat, because it's about a 3-month process, and that's a long time to wait after you've already gone through your application process, and then you find out you are protested by the local governing body because you don't have a land use permit, and it's going to be another 3 months. So we try and keep them in the know early on so that they're not upset and aggravated later. So similarly, the clerk's office really tries to keep the assembly members abreast of what's going on. If we hear about anything with any establishments or applicants, and likewise, if you hear anything, we appreciate the knowledge, so we can work together and make sure that everybody's on the same page, and that we can make sure that both the applicants and the community councils and the local governing body and the state can work together to make everything smooth and a good working relationship.
Let me interrupt you. Is there somebody online with us?
Weddleton here.
Okay. Thank you, John.
So to begin with, I'll start with when the clerk's office receives notice of a deemed complete liquor license application from AMCO. We receive an email with a cover letter that gives us the name of the establishment, what type of application it is, and the rights of the local governing body. So our timelines on when we need to respond to the the ABC board, and then also a copy of the actual application. So first, the clerk's office receives this notice. It's the one on the right. You can see this one was a beverage dispensary. It gives you the type, it gives you the license number. It's just kind of a nice brief overview, and then the application comes with it. As you can see in the blue lettering, the clerk's office estimates the 60-day deadline from when we receive the application, and then we calculate the date out. And this will be the last day that the local governing body has to protest the license. We also calculate our internal dates, what our agenda deadline is, what the assembly meeting date will be, and then our notice to the applicant and AMCO dates.
Mandy, do we also send to committee councils, because they always want to make sure they get enough notice?
We do, yeah. So there's a lot of notices that go on in between all of this, and that's one of them, definitely. And actually, one of the things that we changed is we now send a notice to the community council right off the bat when we receive this. So they get a much longer notice from us than what we had previously been doing.
Thank you, by the way.
And so similarly to the renewals, we set it tentatively to be scheduled on a regular assembly meeting date just prior to, but not exactly on, the 60-day deadline. As I said, the local governing bodies have 60 days from the day they receive the liquor license application to respond to the ABC board with either a waive of their right to protest the issuance or transfer of the license, a waive of the protest but request a list of conditions be added to the license, a protest of the license which requires a public hearing or an opportunity to defend the application at a meeting, and we kind of have some subcategories. So we have like our formal protest, and that one we require the full public hearing, 21-day notice, and then we have our conditional protest. And so the conditional protest is the one where we have like taxes pending or something like that, and so we'll send a notice to AMCO that they have these deficiencies. So there's kind of two subcategories, and I'll get into those a little bit more detail further on. So as Dick brought up with our notices, we have a long list of notices that we send to the applicant, to the state, to the community councils. And so this is just kind of a brief little blurb about all of our notices. We do a receipt to the state, which starts the 60-day deadline. We do a notice to the community council and to the applicant of the pending meeting date. If during the review process there's any deficiencies found, we notify the applicant and give them the opportunity to address those. And then after the assembly meeting, we send notice to the applicant and the AMCO office about the assembly's action on the license. So lastly, if there was a protest, once everything has been addressed and it's resolved, then the assembly gives the clerk's office the authority to notify AMCO that the protest has been lifted.
Suzanne, ma'am?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this process here happens after the special land use permit has been granted?
Sometimes they happen at the same time. So if it's a new license and it's a new location that doesn't already have a land use permit, because the land use permits stick with the land. So as long as there's not a change of use or it's not been vacant for a certain number of time, that land use permit is still valid. So if it was a bar and another bar goes in, they may not have to apply for a special land use permit because there's already one at that location. So if they do need to apply for one, we really try and encourage them when we first hear about it to apply for it, and they can do these concurrently. But they're two separate documents that you see.
And
Anything else, ma'am?
just a follow-up to that, we recently had one in our packet that contained information from the community council about the one on Government Hill.
Oh, yes.
Right, that had a
There-
special point conditions.
Yeah.
And so that would happen on the planning side. of it.
So that was with the license, because that was a license renewal. Whenever the land use comes up, the times you'll see it is if it's a new application, or if there is a modification required, or if it's a change of use. So those don't come before you nearly as often as the license documents.
So if a community council, thank you, Mr. Chair, wanted to have input such as the Government Hill Community Council did with that particular store, it would be at the land use level.
They
Special
could
conditions.
address it that way, but this they did with the license because it was with a renewal. So with our renewals, we send out a notice every year to the community councils, notifying them of which licenses are going to be renewing, and they have an opportunity to request a public hearing. So the ones that you're going to see at the next meeting. So with this one, we also send a notice out that lets them send comment to the assembly on any application. So this was kind of their comment that was submitted along with the transfer. And so that was attached to it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, when an application is received from AMCO, it's reviewed by the clerk's office, the finance department, the fire department, the planning department, and our building official. And so if any issues are found, the clerk's office will prepare an assembly resolution on behalf of the assembly to protest the license. The assembly may protest any liquor license application, whether it be transfer, new, renewal. You have the opportunity for any application. The protest with the reason for the protest must be sent to both the ABC board and the applicant. And Alaska Statute 411, 480 lists the protest options that local governing bodies have. So a license application is protested, the local governing body may need to send a representative to the ABC board to defend that protest. The clerk's
Let me
office.
recommend it from it.
Yep.
And the problem is, we don't have the final say on alcohol licenses. Marijuana we do, but alcohol we don't. So we can protest a license when it goes to the alcohol control board for them to make a final decision. Sometimes they support this, sometimes they don't. It just depends upon the conditions we're protesting. And they use arbitrary, capricious, and unreasonable and other terms. But we have to make sure the reason we're doing it is a good valid reason.
And they
You know,
can,
just, if we didn't like them.
So-
that's for us.
can they invalidate the slut condition then?
No, they do not have any jurisdiction over the special land use permit,
They
so.
don't- The state does not have control of that, we do.
Sort of, but back in history, but at the same time that you and Teshi were recognizing that land use power would give you the right to put conditions, I in the legislature was establishing the right to put on a state license conditions. So sort of two legal paths to the same
I work
idea
at the
that.
same time.
Yeah, and only lately I've been learning that they really haven't been talking to each other very well, but it's felt particularly, Mandy's helping us sort of work on version 2. Both are valid. You as a land use have these conditions, and the state put the same arbitrary capricious, or we put as a writer, that so the state can put conditions on this liquor license. They don't always put the ones we put through land use. And that's a problem because they have the enforcement power, right? They're the ones who, not as much as they used to, but can send people in with a fake ID or looking underage.
You know,
or
they
whatever.
might do that anymore, but.
They don't have a lot of funding to do it. But so it's hard for us to know or enforce when we say don't sell the cheapest form of vodka, whether they're really doing that or not. So I've been doing a fair amount of work with Erica and Mandy on helping me get the conditions that we have out there, and then communicating those to the state, asking them to put those on as state restrictions, so that both have the identical conditions.
Anything else in the same members?
Well, I guess I want to.
Go ahead.
So I just, from my own understanding that if we were to ask for a condition and the state were for whatever reason to say, no, we're not going to put that condition on the license, we still would have recourse through the SLUP, right?
Right.
But the problem is that, Eric says, we don't really have enforcement ability. Other
That's
than,
why
I
you have
guess,
to send people like Jack Frost through.
that's just like we use code enforcement,
Yeah.
but it's just not something we have done very actively.
And we have to maintain, I understand when hours Jack works.
Right.
Sometimes they get off at 5 and he didn't, well, they're late or
He
something.
could, it's right, it's not really his thing too, right?
Right.
So, he could do it, but it's not a perfect fix.
And what would be, if we find they're violating the SLUP, do we fine them, or can we actually shut down their operations?
I would need a legal answer on that because I know what I'd rather do with them, but that's just me.
Well, anyway.
Mr. Gates?
Through the chair, the land use enforcement violations depend on which violation it is, but typically they are fine only, unless deemed, or I guess Bill, if you're still here, is there any case in which a land use violation fine can escalate to closure of a business?
So the example is where we put a condition on an alcohol license that says, don't serve the cheapest form of vodka, and we find that they are, and we prove that they are. Can we bring back up the license? The license again is.
Not the license, it's a special land use permit.
Right, the license resides in the state in that case, what is it, do we have to fine them and wait for their license to be back up and protest it?
That's a good question.
So I do have some in mind. Oh,
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
I think from my past experience with Title 21 issues, land use and land use permits, there's a number of different enforcement options. So it really, I guess, depends on the nature and character of the special land use permit violation, what condition they're not following, and then I guess code enforcement or the law department decide or what's the appropriate enforcement action depending on that violation. You know, so I wouldn't say that there's a set enforcement, like it can be injunction relief or fines or something like that. So that's, I think, the response I can give right now without looking to go further.
Four lawyers answered, and none of us have provided you with relevant information.
Now, some of you are gonna have to work on.
I just
it.
asked.
Because here's
We
the
are going to
problem.
bill you, Eric.
The AMCO board are political appointees. Need like, take a look at who makes up the AMCO board. The people here work for it, but they're not the people appointed to it. They're political appointees. Some come from the alcohol industry. And they don't really like to take action against their own brothers and sisters. So it's always a problem to deal with. Mandy, go ahead.
Okay. So one of the things that I am going to touch on is the options for protest, and so there are a few different avenues that you can go down besides the special land use permit if throughout their operating time something is going on, you want to address it. There are opportunities outside of when an application is received to do that. So let's see. So with the types of protest, like I said, we kind of have subcategories of our protest. We have one that we've deemed like a conditional protest, and these are the ones where we're protesting for taxes due. We haven't gotten a certification from one of the reviewing departments, such as the fire department or the building safety department, or they don't have their SLUP. So these are things that they're going to do. It's just a matter of the time frame, the time constraints. And so we've deemed them a conditional protest because we don't want to hold up their application, make them go through a full formal public hearing, and delay their process for not really a real reason when they're going to be doing these anyways. So in this case, they are protested. They're going to be notified of the protest, and they will be sent notice that they have the right to be heard because they're going to be protested. So they'll be given the date of the assembly meeting, which their license is going to be on the agenda. If they decide that they would like to defend their application to the assembly, they would let the clerk's office know, and we would let the assembly know that the applicant will be there. This is the item number. If you would pull it, then that way the applicant can come up and either explain what the situation is, or you would have the opportunity to ask the application or the applicant or the licensee why there's these holdups.
And this happened before, okay? We've had owners come in and just, tell us why we should take action on the license. Go ahead, Mandy.
And then the second one is kind of more of our formal protest. So this one is going to be like public safety concerns, if they are continually violating either state or city law, or if they're not complying with conditions on their license. So these ones we handle more formally with the public hearing process in municipal code. And these ones would require somebody from the municipality to also go before the ABC board to defend that protest as to why we are not wanting this license issued.
Mandy, let me interrupt you for a second. If it's a tax issue, AMCO board works with us well. We've seen licenses pulled because we're protesting on taxes. AMCO board has not given them the license until they correct the problem. So they worked very well with us on that issue. Go ahead, Mandy, sorry.
That's okay. So we have those, and then One of the other options is not a protest, but it's the option to notify the ABC board if a licensee has violated state or city law. And so if we hear something at the clerk's office, if there's complaints received, or if assembly members receive notice that something's going on in an establishment that's against state or city law, we can just send the AMCO office notice, and they'll start an investigation potentially to look into whether it's a violation or not. So there's not like a formal.
That process does work. I've got one in my area on Tudor Road that only has a beer and wine license, but it's serving cocktails. It's hard liquor. They don't have a license to do that. So I asked Mandy to get hold of AMCO for them to take a look at how are they able to serve hard liquor when all they've got is a beer and wine license.
Is this one of our restaurants? That's your home?
It's a restaurant, yes. And I've got their menu that says cocktails, Bloody Marys, and things like that are served. They don't have a license to do that. Anyway, sorry to bother you.
No, you're good. I like your stories help reiterate
Well, I've been on this
my
for a
points.
while.
I know. You've seen a lot of it.
Should have seen the time we required some of the package stores to put labels on their liquor bottles.
See that?
They
Yeah.
threw a fit when we did that. That was my little princess shoot myself. We had fun doing that.
So a little bit more of a breakdown of the two protests. So the ones that we've deemed the conditional protests, like I said, it still requires that the applicant be given the right to be heard. We're still within the 60-day constraint to reply back to AMCO. But this one, like I said, we probably would not need to go before the ABC board to defend the protest. The formal protest probably would be required to send somebody from the Muni to defend that protest. So if there isn't an issue through the review process, we haven't found anything wrong with the application, they're in compliance with everything, all of the reviewing departments have certified, then the clerk's office will draft an assembly memorandum on behalf of the assembly that lists the findings of the review and notifies the applicant and the ABC board that the assembly has waived their right to protest and they have no objection to the ABC board issuing the license. So I kind of wanted to give a little scenario because it's a lot of information and there's a lot that's gone on, and I think trying to grasp like what your options actually are, there's a lot more than I think we can see typically when we're kind of doing it. So I just did a little scenario of kind of similar to one that we've gone through recently. So first, assembly members will probably start to hear complaints from constituents. Your community councils might come to you and start complaining about an establishment. There's a packaged liquor store that is operating and they've heard that the packaged liquor store is wanting to open up another location down the street. So unfortunately, they may not have been a good neighbor. There's cheap bottles of fortified beer. The trash is never picked up around the store. Residents in the neighborhood complain that they may have to step around people who are taking naps on the sidewalk. So this is an extreme situation. There is no way that that store can have another license up the street. So what can the assembly do? They've asked APD and code enforcement about the location and if they have any dirt. They've asked the clerk's office if there have been any complaints filed or if there's been any NOVs. It turns out that the establishment has not been a good operator. So what can the assembly do? Once the clerk's office receives the application for the transfer from AMCO for the second package store license, the municipal review process will begin. Since we already know that this owner has issues because we've heard from the assembly, we've heard from the community councils, we've heard from constituents, we kind of flag it. And at the request of the assembly chair and support of the vice chair and the chair of the public safety committee, as the ones who sponsor the liquor license documents, the clerk's office begins to draft an AR. And so we would be protesting the transfer of the packaged liquor store license pending a public hearing. And then once the notice has been sent out to the applicant and the community council, the AR will go before the assembly. They'll grant the public hearing to the community council and set it for a future date. Typically it'll be the next assembly meeting. And so then the clerk's office will draft an AR that would continue the protest of the transfer, or we would draft, we would draft an AM which would waive the right of the protest. And so at the assembly meeting after the public hearing, you hear both sides, you weigh your evidence, you decide, A, there wasn't a problem after all. It was a big mistake. Turns out it's liquor store B that's across the street that's been the one that's been causing all the problems. And so you would have pulled the AM that would be waiving the right to protest and pull the AR, which would be continuing the protest. And if you decided that you wanted to go ahead and waive your right to protest that, you would move the AM for approval. If you decided that it was a valid protest, there was issues, you would move the AR continuing the protest, and that would be sent to AMCO. And at that point, they would set a public hearing on their end as well. So it's kind of a long process, and the clerk's office worked to make a little cheat sheet, and this is in the handouts, and we are also going to be putting them in your assembly binders so that when you're at the meeting, it's a quick reference. If you have questions, you can kind of go through. I apologize that the handouts were small.
Maybe
They
you make
didn't
it larger
print right
for our
me.
book.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. some
It
of
didn't
us are
print
getting
right for
blind,
me.
so we don't-
But this is kind of a nice little matrix of the type of action that you're wanting to do, the period of action, so how long we have before we need to respond back to the ABC board, and then if a public hearing is required, if it is, what kind of legislation is required, and then your final product, whether you're gonna waive your right to protest or whether you're gonna continue the protest, and then kind of your breakdown there, whether the AR moves or the AM moves, and then what the action on the license would end up being. So I will get a bigger image for you. But that's what I have, and so if there's any questions.
Questions from any members? Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, are we going through this just for informational purposes, or are we planning to streamline the process or make changes?
This is informational, and we kind of did it now because it's timely. You may have seen on the agenda for the meeting next week, there's a public hearing request for 2 brown jugs. So this process, is kind of something that I think is a little, it's not one that we deal with very often. We don't have too many requests from community councils for public hearings. So we wanted to do kind of a refresher to let you guys know what you'd be.
If there's any NOVs for the 2 locations, because for us, if we're gonna protest a license, you have to have some rational reason for protesting it.
Right.
And that would be if, for example, there's NOVs that AMCO has on file, we get a copy of. That gives us some reason, just because we don't like those stores there. That's a little harder for us to deal with. Go ahead, Steve.
So, has the Mountain View Community Council protested, or are they aware of the situation?
Mhm. Yep, so actually this is a renewal, and earlier in the year, they were sent the notice that these were going to be renewing, and so by the deadline that they were required to, they submitted a community council resolution requesting that the assembly would hold a public hearing on the renewal.
But it doesn't say why they're doing it or what action they want us to take. So I asked Mandy to get a hold of the community council president and find out, okay, you want a hearing, why? You know, what do you want to accomplish? Because we need to know from the community council why they want us to hold a public hearing on it.
What are the issues we're going to get information about? Or
Yeah, and so we've, you know, being that it's not something that you guys see very often, we kind of wanted to do this to kind of be a refresher of what you're going to be seeing. So it's going to be an AR that will grant the public hearing and that will protest the license pending the public hearing. And then we'll hold the public hearing at the following meeting, and then that's kind of what you're going to see. You're going to see your options after. So.
Thanks.
Other questions? Mr. Franz, Mr. Crop, anything? Mr. Dunbar? Anything else, Mandy?
Mr. Chair.
Amco.
I wasn't sure when the appropriate time for me to speak would be.
Anytime
but
you want.
Thank you. I just have a few comments. I know that in the past there have been some standoffs between, so to speak, between the board and the assembly as to who should be dealing with problem licensees. I heard you mention rum runners, and I know that that was a pretty controversial issue. And former director Cindy Franklin and I became aware through really that and some other issues that many local governments were not truly aware of what their rights and responsibilities were as far as what you could do with problem licensees. And really our statute gives a lot of latitude to the local government, and it says that the board shall uphold a protest unless it's arbitrary and capricious and unreasonable. So that's a pretty big burden.
So we can be one of those, but not all three of them?
That's right, you can be one. And when I've been with AMCO, formerly just ABC board, for about 6.5 years, and so I've seen a couple of instances where the board determined somehow that a protest was arbitrary and capricious and unreasonable, which the staff may or may not have been in complete agreement with. Since then, we have new board members. Former Director Franklin and I have been doing a lot of board training because, it's a volunteer board and they don't get paid. They meet 5 times a year, and it's our job to inform them of what the laws actually say and make sure that they're educated so that they can be making appropriate decisions. And in the past few years, they have upheld, I believe, 2 municipal protests, 2 licenses that weren't for tax
Spirits
reasons.
of Alaska, there on Gamble.
Yes.
That was a big one where they actually videotaped what was going on there. And we protested, they upheld us.
And then I can't remember if you guys protested fantasies or not.
Oh, yes.
That one just...
In an hour, I'll tell you all about fantasies.
Well, I know that there was also an objection from Department of Labor, and we just wanted
Yeah, it was.
Superior Court.
There was a workman's comp issue.
So yes, there were many issues, but we did just win in Superior Court. So the board, additionally, there was a protest that the city of Nome made a few years ago because they protested a beverage dispensary license because of saturation issues. They felt like there were too many BDLs in their community, and the board upheld that protest. And so this board is different than it was a few years ago. The staff is drastically different than it was a number of years ago. And we're working hard to educate both local governments and our board members to make sure that everybody's obviously taking appropriate action. You have a lot of opportunity to protest a license if you have really any concerns about it. And so I would encourage you to remember that and not just think that you don't have any option except for taxes, because you do. Additionally, on a different note, there was discussion about conditions on a license versus a special land use permit. And the assembly, of course, does have the option of doing both. As you guys discussed, a key difference is with a special land use permit, the board has no authority over that. But if you put conditions, if you request conditions on a license and the board determines that they aren't arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable, then, which is different than a protest to the license itself, which requires the and, then it is still, under the statute, the responsibility of the local governing body for monitoring compliance with a condition, except as otherwise provided for the board. So it is still the muni's responsibility, but the board, our enforcement team can assist with enforcement. Now, if you do find that a licensee is violating conditions that were placed on the actual license itself, you as a body at any time can make our office aware, which you recently have through Mandy, either formally or informally. And then our office, either if it's informally, our office will conduct an investigation. If it's a formal process, which is set forth in one of our statutes, I'd be happy, or I think Mandy has provided the reference in her material. But we have to go through our administrative process, which is, they're all long administrative processes, but we actually issue a formal accusation. There are very specific procedures set forth in the Administrative Procedure Act. And as Mandy also articulated, it is still the responsibility of the assembly to defend your position. So it's slightly different, it's quite different than violating a special land use permit, where the board will actually get, is required to get more involved. So I just wanted to clear up a couple of those questions and or concerns. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
NOVs, the board used to send sting operations out, and I've not seen those in 2 years being done at the amount they were done before.
Sure.
I used to watch when they'd come through, see all the NOVs. Are you guys just don't have the funding for it, or what? Or has everybody got perfect all of a sudden?
Hardly. That actually was something else that I wanted to talk about, so thank you for bringing that up, Mr. Chair. So the compliance check program used to be funded through, I believe, a federal grant. That was a 6-figure grant. We lost that grant 4 or 5 years ago.
How much money was it?
I don't know the exact amount. I'm sorry, I was an examiner at the time and was not really involved in the budget at all.
If you
but
find out and let me know. I'd
Sure,
appreciate it.
sure, I will make a note of that.
Maybe in our best interest to try and appropriate some of our funds to pay for these
Okay.
visits.
It
Because
was,
we used to count on that as a way to keep the industry on its toes.
well, maybe we can have a meeting with our offices again at a later date about the compliance check program, but we are working to get that back up and running. We are working, we're waiting for a memorandum of agreement from actually Cindy Franklin, who now is an AAG, from the Department of Revenue. They have investigators who do compliance checks for tobacco establishments. So we're working on kind of tag teaming with them to reinstate the compliance check program. And I just wanted to clarify for the record that the compliance check program involves underage people using their real IDs going into establishments. We do not send people who are over the age of 20 and a half into those establishments with fake IDs, just to clarify. But we are working on reinstating it.
John, any questions, sir? Okay. From the Sunday members that are here. Pete, Forrest, anything, Eric? Sure. Thank you. There are no questions.
Yep. And like I said, if anything comes up throughout the year, if you have any questions about anything, please let us know. We are happy to do research if we don't know it.
It's been a while since we've gotten to, I think fantasies might have been the last one. I'm trying to think of the last time we had it. When I first got on the board, I feel like in the assembly, I feel like we had one or two, but you guys haven't seen a serious alcohol issue since you've been elected. So,
We had the Spirit of Alaska that went back and forth and appeals and all sorts of things. That was probably right
before I even got on, and then we, did fantasies, and I think there was some other one that got resolved before it went too far. Oh, we had the, round back. That was what we were talking about.
A lot of times, the community councils want us to protest the licenses, they just don't like having it in their neighborhood. The problem is, show me where we've got MOB on that license, you can't find it. And sometimes you just arbitrary capricious, and you just wanna say, let's shut this store down.
Does anyone have any update on Brownback? Because that was a conflict with the neighbors. You haven't heard about that?
Going downtown?
6 months or so.
I'm not aware of any recent complaints about them.
Good.
We haven't received any either.
They resolved it. Maybe they brought some sandwiches over to the condo association.
Nothing else going on, we're done. Thanks for being here.
Sarah.